Is that better? I had the microphone off. Sorry about that. So, like I said, you guys weren't able to hear me, but yeah, we was thrashing right up to 3 minutes ago to put everything together. So, hopefully that fixes the sound now. I apologize for that. So I was saying, been thrashing on the Regal, trying to get that thing ready to roll. Had a lot of plumbing and wiring and a lot of missing parts, and so it kind of got me behind the 8 ball on that project there, because just trying to figure out where all the stuff is, and trying to get all the parts ordered, and people don't have stuff in stock, and it's always a last minute thrash, but making progress, and we'll be having the Smurf will be back soon. We'll be getting the motor back in that thing, and we'll be ready. Like I said, March 29th and 30th, South Georgia Motorsports Park, having a big grudge race up there, and we'll have the cars up there. So keep plugging along. I think Mike, you at Bike Week, or was that last week? Hard to keep up with all that stuff. But I put a little slideshow together for braided hose today. We talked about brake lines last week, and so thought I'd do a little tutorial on what I know of assembling braided hose, and what tools make your job and your life a lot easier. Oh, Mike says Bike Week was last week. Very cool. Hope you had a good time. Yeah, so things are starting to click along. Now Bike Week and Daytona, and now all the drag racing is starting to pick up. So it's going to, as we get towards summer, everything starts getting a little bit crazier around here. Trying to get cars done, and different events we have to go to, and stuff like that. But just all we can do is keep making progress. Didn't get much done on the Chevelle this week. Worked it on a little bit on last Saturday, and the Firebird. They both kind of got backburnered with the amount of work that needed to be done on the Regal. So not a lot of progress updates on that stuff, but needless to say, we are making progress on all that stuff. So we'll just keep plucking away, and getting things done. Sorry about that. I'm kind of still organizing things that we're going to look at here in a minute. So apologize about that. And along with all that, anybody that's friends with me on Facebook, we've been doing major house renovations all at the same time. So it's been a very hectic month between the family cruise and everything else. A lot of stuff's been going on. So, but that's life. Keeps us young. It keeps us working. So. Let's see. I didn't. Well, again, since the Regal took up most of my time, we didn't do anything with the NASCAR either. Moved a lot of parts around. The trailer's packed full of, become a warehouse now. So all the components are in there and stuff. So hopefully we'll get through these next 2 weeks, and then we'll be able to get back on our regular scheduled work and get all that stuff done. Got to get Bert's 6-cylinder AMC turbo motor assembled. Had an issue with the crank clearances not being right, so had to get the crank polished. Mike says first week of March. Wait, hang on a second. Sorry about that. I got to move my screen here. First week of March was the firm in Stark for the Southeast Adventure Vehicle Expo. Wow, that's pretty cool. There were a bunch of cool setups. maybe next year I can represent with a Landis shirt. Absolutely. I got to get back on that. Maybe I need to find somebody that does a little bit of graphic design on the side. I've got sketches drawn, but when I put them into a program to get the shirts made, it was a nightmare. I didn't have it set up correctly, and when I got the demoed shirts, they were really bad, and I just haven't found any time to get back to any of that. So I definitely got to get the merch back up and going. It just takes a little bit of time, unfortunately. I'm really sorry about that. Bear with me, but I've got the designs. I just got to figure out either how I'm going to find some time, or if I can get somebody to put the designs in and get them done, so we can get the shirts done. I probably said, it was probably 10 episodes ago, but I was going to start off with a print and pay company to host the shirts. That way we could see which ones sell, which ones don't, and then eventually I'll be able to get enough analytics off of the sales to where I can actually go to a shirt guy and have the shirts made, and we just handle it all ourselves. But for now, I don't have the extra time for shipping and handling and all that stuff. So I mean, that the print to order deal would be a whole lot better. Get the names out, get some shirts out there. So Mike, bear with me, and anybody else, we will have some merch eventually. I didn't think it was going to be that big of an undertaking. It really is. Especially I'm not so computer literate. I can thumb my way through things, but I'm not sharp at all on that by any means. But we will get those stuff done, and like I say, if anybody knows anybody that does that stuff, for free would be cool, but I wouldn't. I'll pay somebody, because I just don't have the time to get it done in a timely manner. I really want to get those things moving. So, spread the word around, and we'll see if we can find somebody that can help us out on that stuff. But I guess we can do this little deal on the steel braid that I put together today. Let's go. I got to switch screens here. So this is some of the basic tools needed for doing a steel braid hose. AN wrenches. I prefer the little snap-on adjustable wrenches that are in the foreground. You can see that the length of the AN wrenches, the bigger the size wrench, the longer the handle. There's a reason for that. That's to, on purpose, adjust how much torque you can put on the fittings. And you can see with the snap-on wrenches, they're pretty short-handled also. That's the reason why I like them. I'm not a super huge fan of adjustable wrenches, but these are very good quality. And they open up really well. The little one here on the left is maybe 6 inches long, and it'll open to 1.25 inches. And then the next one is about 8.5 inches long, and it'll open to, I think, 1.5 inches or 1.75 inches. So those two wrenches will handle all the AN stuff you need. It's convenient because the AN wrenches fit the AN nuts, but they don't fit all the adapters. So you always have to use something else in between anyway. So I just found it much easier. I can use these two wrenches, and I can adjust the adapters. I can do all that stuff. So it just makes it real easy for me to do that. There's another picture of the snap-on ones. I don't know if they're U.S. made or German made, but they're really high quality. I've never rounded a nut with these. They just work very, very well, and they definitely get tight on the fitting. They stay very square, so you don't have any chances of rounding anything off. And these are very old wrenches. I mean, I probably had them now, I'd say close to 10 years. So they work really well. real big necessity is a set of V blocks. These are pretty decent ones from Red Horse. Fragola has a really good set too with strong magnets, so they stay in the vise. But you can put your fittings down from the top, so you can work your hose in, and then you can put them in from the side to tighten the clamps down, which I'll show you in a couple minutes. So you can make hoses on the car and stuff with 2 wrenches in hand, but this is a much faster way of doing it. And the other nice thing is with that short adjustable wrench, I can spin 360 on the fitting in the vise, so I don't have to slide on and off the hex to run them in. This is what I use for cutters. Is an old set of cable cutters from probably from a cable truck or something like that. Mike wouldn't know anything about that. But this is what I like to use. I got to keep it filed up pretty sharp when I'm cutting steel braid, but most of the braid nowadays is the black Nomex, which has braid in it, but it's not as dense of braid as the old silver stuff had. But this makes a nice clean cut. There's no dust or remnants of the hose inside or anything. It keeps everything nice and clean. Just a really nice way of doing it. Obviously, that's how you put it on your mark and then squeeze them down and make a cut. And the other thing I like about using that pair of cutters is it's got it. If you go back, you can see it's 2 C's going in opposite directions. So when it cuts, it's closing down on the hose as it cuts. So you can see there, no frayed steel braid and no tape on the steel braid. I'm able to cut it in a clean cut and put it right into use. Whereas if you're using the cutoff wheel like this, or any other type of chop saw or miter saw or anything with an abrasive wheel, or they make a steel wheel that doesn't have teeth on it, but anyway, all those, you can see where the wires start to fray. So when you're using an abrasive wheel, you really need to put tape around the fitting, around the hose when you cut it, so that it keeps the fraying of the steel braid to a minimum. But then you got to remember, you got to take the tape off to put it in the fitting. A lot of people don't do that, and it's not a proper fitting, not a proper way to assemble the fitting, and it won't hold up to the burst pressures that the fittings are rated for, because you have the tape in there, which actually acts like a bearing and lets it slide out. Hey John, happy you guys make it on tonight. So here's what happens when you use the cutoff wheel. You get all this black powdery stuff that's in the hose. There's a ton in the hose, and it makes a mess. You have to flush hoses when you cut with an abrasive wheel. You have to. I do it even when I cut with the shear style, but nothing ever comes out because it doesn't make any powder or any dust or anything. So once you get this done, if the braid starts fraying, as like on this other end, Cool Tools makes this cool tool that you put these plastic blocks together, and there's the instructions. You put the fitting inside and you put it in the vise, and you can twist the hose into the fitting. So there's a Fragola fitting sleeve sitting in there. Put the other half on, and then you can put it in the vise. You can see how it makes a nice funnel for working the hose in. And if you notice on the tool, there's a lot of abrasion marks from working hose in. But that was when I was using the cutoff wheel. Once I went to the shears, I don't even use these tools anymore. So once you get the sleeve, once you get the hose cut, you put the sleeve over the hose, and you bring the edge of the hose up to the bottom of the threads in the fitting. And then you're almost ready to assemble. Then this is when these tools come in. And it doesn't have to necessarily be this particular tool, this gold T cross, is actually for FTE hose, the nylon solid line hose, and then the other one is just a hose wedger. But you can use anything that's a big punch or anything, and what you do is you drive that into the hose through the sleeve to get the hose round and to stretch it out as well as you can to the sleeve. So once you've done that, now we're ready to put fittings in. And there's two main type of braided hose fittings. This is a single swedge style, so you can see that it's got a small area, which is the size of the ID of the hose at rest, and then it ramps up to a higher diameter, and then it rolls into the threads. So that fitting goes in, and what it does is it pushes the braid into the sleeve, and that's what locks it in. So inside the sleeve, there's rings. I didn't get a picture of it, but there's rings in there to grab the OD of the hose. That's why you don't want electrical tape on the hose after you cut it, because it will work as a bearing and assist the hose from sliding out, and it could rupture if you're running high pressure on it. So this one, you screw it in, and it swedges the hose out, and that's what gets it in. There's a close-up of this diameter versus the larger diameter where the threads are. This is a used fitting. And then there's the cutter style. This style has a much higher burst rating than the single swedge, and it works very similar. So you've got your OD sleeve here, that's the ID of the hose, and then it's got a gap between this cutter edge where it actually cuts into the rubber and separates. Half the rubber stays in the fitting, the other half goes out into the sleeve to make a higher load in the sleeve to keep the line from pulling out. And well, it's not really a good picture, but I was hoping you could see there's a empty void here where it actually will cut into the hose, and part of the hose will go up inside the sleeve, and the other part will go over top of it like the single swedge style fitting. So after you get the hose in your sleeve, and you put some type of wedge tool in there to get it opened up as much as you can, it's time to put the fitting in. Now I use engine assembly lube, and the reason I do that because it doesn't deteriorate it won't harm the rubber, and it has a good viscosity and won't really like wash off right away. So I lube the sleeve where it's going to go into the hose, and then I lube the threads where it goes into the sleeve, because all the AN stuff is 99% of it is aluminum, and it's anodized, but it's not. It will gall. Anytime you work with aluminum, it will gall, and you may make a hose and realize that the angle is wrong or something. You got to take it back apart again. If you don't lube the threads properly, you're going to ruin the fitting. When you take it back out, it'll gall, and the threads will get chewed up, and now you've got a expensive paperweight that's not very heavy. But yeah, so you want to use lube. I've seen people use Never Sees, but I don't think the Never Sees it's a little thicker of a material, so it doesn't spread around. It kind of just works out of the threads as you're screwing it into the fitting, where the Royal Purple will, this is Royal Purple, but any assembly lube will stay in the threads and work its way through. You can use motor oil too. I think motor oil dissipates a little quicker, especially with higher temps. So I found fittings with oil don't come apart as easy, but the ones with assembly lube come apart and look brand new when you take them apart. So again, because everything's aluminum, you want to get your fitting started into the sleeve by hand and try to get at least a turn on it. That way you know the threads are engaged, they're aligned properly. It's way easy to put the sleeve in the vise and push in on the fitting and start turning it, and it's going to go because it's aluminum, so it's going to feel like it's going in. And after you get about 2.5 turns, you'll find out it's cross-threaded, and now you've ruined the part. And especially a fitting like this is a number 12 fitting with a number 10 ORB on the end. This is probably a $35, $40 fitting, so it's something you don't want to trash if you don't have to. You want to keep them lubed and assembled properly, so you'll get lots of good use out of it. So once you get it started, now I will put it in the vise. So we know the thread, I turn the fitting in by hand, a thread or two. I know it's engaged properly. So now it's going to get to the point where you can't go any farther by hand. You're going to have to put it in the vise and start turning it with a wrench. And this being a cutter style, it takes a lot of effort once you get down to the very end of the end of the fitting when you're getting close to the sleeve. The single swedge type, you can get those pretty far by hand and finish them up. They're a lot easier to do off the car when you don't have a vise. The cutter style, pretty much only way to do it is with a vise. You're going to have a hard time unless you got really big forearms, and probably have to go to some pretty long wrenches. But I just want to show this. This is why we use an ORB when you're working in tight spots. So with this ORB to hose end, your hose end is on a swivel here, and then you have a swivel here, and it's got the AN male with the O-ring to go into oil pump, fuel pump, whatever, where normally you would have to use a fitting, adapter fitting, male to male, like that, and then use your hose end. And actually, buying all those parts, it's more expensive than buying the ORB hose end all in one, all inclusive. Plus, it's a lot tighter fitment on this particular hose assembly I'm making. It's for a dry sump pump, and the steering and everything's all right in the way, so you don't have room for a lot of stuff going on, especially when you're using a size 12 hose. It takes up quite a bit of room. Now, I prefer to use this style fitting with the tube in it, but that was not available in a step, since this is a 10 on this side and a 12 on that side. Fragola only makes that style with a tube in tube style fitting in 12 to 12, 10 to 10, straight through fittings. When you do a step fitting, they go to the forged. It's not bad. This is on the suction side of the oil pump, so it will work fine. You do want to bear in mind when you're laying out your fittings what's going to be traveling through it and the volume, and if you can get that to work properly or not. Whenever you have anything fluid that's going to be pressurized and you need like gasoline and water, you definitely want to use a tube style fitting, because the fluid will go a lot smoother, where this could aerate a little bit as the fuel's going by. So like I said, when you're using a cutter style fitting and you're in the vise and you're getting it in, I see tons and tons of hoses that were done at other places, and that's what they look like when they're finished. That is not correct. The rating on these fittings is for the fitting nut to be butted up tight to the sleeve. So now that there's a gap, the cutter part is not swedging the hose into the sleeve properly, and this will fail if it's under high pressure. It would probably fail anyway, but definitely it's not something you'd want to run on a fuel line or an oil line. It's going to be under high pressure, because it will probably fail, and then you're going to have a big problem. That is how it's supposed to look when it's finished, all the way in tight. And that will now have the same rating as far as hose pull out from the sleeve that they have in the catalog. So I believe this fitting is good for 350 psi when it's finished off properly like this. Sometimes, being that I lube the fittings up good with the assembly lube, I can reuse a lot of fittings. And when you're dealing with fittings that cost anywhere from cheap side $25 all the way up into the 50s and 60s, sometimes using a used fitting helps the pocketbook out quite a bit. And there's a trick that I've learned a long time ago, and it works really well. So on black fittings, you use a black Sharpie, and it's not perfect, but that's a pretty up close picture, and it looks pretty darn nice. And a red and a blue Sharpie will work just as well on red and blue AN fittings. So I always keep a handful of those in my toolbox. Sometimes you may have a spot where you can't get the wrench on the fitting real good, and you may mar up the hex a little bit. You can take that marker and you can clean them up and hit them up with the ink dye, and it looks great. John says, so similar to hydraulic hoses. Yes, I mean, that's basically, I don't know which one came first, the AN, which stands for Army Navy, or the hydraulic hose, but yes, all these assemble very similar to each other. Of course, the hydraulic stuff is all steel, so it's a lot more robust and will take a lot more abuse than the lightweight aluminum stuff will. But very good fittings. It's really good to way to set up a car, hot rod. One thing I didn't denote earlier: all these fittings have swivels in them. I always use a swivel fitting because that way your hose is always going to have a natural twist to it from being rolled up on spools or whatever, and just the way it lays on the engine sometimes. So with the swivel fittings, you can roll that to where everything helps you out. Mike asked, what's the difference between a black braid and the steel braid? So the steel braid is a double layer stainless steel wire with the rubber in between, and the black braid is a Nomex outer braid and a steel braid inner core for the strength. So they basically have almost the same burst pressures, but the black hose obviously is a lot smoother on the hands. Anybody's worked on old school steel braid lines, after they've been on the car for a while, they'll slice you up like razor blades. And the thing was, in the original Army Navy AN days, a steel braid was all they had. Racing has caused the introduction of the nylon braided or the Nomex braided hoses for lighter weight. You can take a car that has a typical race car that has a 4-stage or 3-stage dry sump system, an EFI fuel system, AN hoses on the cooling system, and convert from the steel braid to the black braid. And I've seen where it's taken 25, 30 pounds out of the car. And that being said, the next level of racing braid is crimp on. I don't have a crimp machine here, so I don't use them too much. But there's even a lighter weight hose, and they have fittings that instead of screwing together like this, it actually goes in a machine and crimps more like the hydraulic stuff does. And those are almost 50% lighter than this style fitting. John says JIC Joint Industrial Council. Right. All you guys are JIC. It's real. Some of that stuff is the same size, but they have, like, we go 4, 6, 8, 10. I know, like, there's a JIC 5, I think, and there's some other ones that are like in between. I've seen sometimes gotten cars in that were plumbed by a hydraulic guy, I guess, and they used fittings that we couldn't replace the hose. We had to replace everything because the adapters and everything were all an odd size, hydraulic size. But racing, you always want to try to be as light as possible on stuff like that. So this is the final project, final product of what I was doing today. So 3-stage dry sump. It's actually a 4-stage pump. So you have 3 stages of suction and 1 stage of pressure. So the suction side pulls all the oil out of the pan, so the pan theoretically is dry, and you're actually pulling a vacuum on the engine internally to pull the oil off of the crankshaft. So you're taking parasitic weight out of the engine. When you balance a crankshaft, the machine shop will calculate bob weights, and that's the weight of the rings, the piston, the wrist pin, the connecting rod, and the bearing. And then they will add a certain amount of oil, weight, for the amount of oil that's going to be residual on the components. And then, of course, between the rod journal and the crank journal, you have oil spraying out as it's leaving the surface. It's going out and fresh oil is going in. So all that oil becomes scavenge, and it gets all over, bounces back into the oil pan. The stuff that's flinging down will go into the pan, but the stuff that's flinging out and up goes up and then lands back in the crankshaft and makes the crank heavier. And it's not a lot, but when you're racing and you're looking for every little bit of advantage you can get, going to a dry sump system like this will usually pick up 20-30 horsepower, because you can get all the oil out of the oil pan and back into your your dry sump tank, and then ready to go back into the oil pump and then back into the engine. So just it's a great way of doing it. It takes a lot of plumbing though. So this is a really bad picture, but this is the JIC fittings, and you can see why I was really tight clearance, because there's the steering shaft right there. I think I got a better picture. There's a better picture from the front. So if you had an adapter fitting in there and then a hose fitting on top of that, you can see that there's not a lot of room for all that stuff. And that happens a lot when you're working on a race car, because you're trying to set the engine as low in the chassis as you can, but you still have to have a car that drives and has suspension. So, everybody's trying to take up the same real estate. So you have to get creative with fittings. Most of these fittings come in like every 15 degrees of bend. So straight, they'll have a 15, a 30, a 45, a 60, a 90, a 120, a 150, a 180. So there's a lot of different fitting shapes you can get to help get all this packaging into the race car. So that's what we were doing today, getting all that stuff all situated. Some other parts I wanted to show you. These are bulkhead fittings from Race Part Solutions, our buddies up in Georgia. John and Darren, they make these in-house. So instead of having a bulkhead going through the sheet metal with washers and nuts and a standard bulkhead fitting, which then when you're tightening it up on the inside or the outside, you have to have somebody help you, because the bulkhead can come loose when you're tightening one side of it, because one side's a part of the main fitting, the other side is just a nut. So it's quite cumbersome when you're using bulkhead fittings. They came up with these nice little jewels. It's actually a billet piece that has the mail on both sides, but a flange that bolts to the car. So now, the bulkhead isn't twisting the firewall because it doesn't have a small washer and nut, a very small contact area, which then the weight of the hoses and stuff usually bends the firewall. This has a flange that's through bolted. So now you've got a billet flange bolted onto the firewall. So now that gives the firewall rigidity. Plus now the male part of the fitting will not turn. No matter what side you're on, you can take your wrench, tighten the fitting up, and it's tight, and it didn't twist the part inside the other side of the firewall. So you can use these all over the car. You got a fuel cell in the trunk, and you got to go. You can run a rubber grommet with the hose going through, but it's a lot cleaner to use a bulkhead fitting like this, and then it's solid. You don't have to worry about the grommet getting cut and then the metal cutting the hose and stuff like that. So it just makes it real clean assembly. and that's one of the things. I didn't have everything finished on it, so I couldn't get all the pictures of all the braid that I did. Here's another picture of those bulkhead fittings. But yeah, I try to organize everything so it makes sense, and so that there's room to work on other components. A big thing on the dry sump on this engine was the original plumbing, the original routing of the plumbing that was on it when I got the car. The hoses actually had to go around the frame and around the steering to reach everything. It worked, but the problem is if you ever want to do any quick maintenance on the car, or if you need to pull the motor out to do maintenance, you're going to have to take all the lines apart. There's going to be oil everywhere. It just makes it crazy. In my eyes, I try to make everything packaged properly. So now, when we're done, we can just take this engine out and not have to undo any oil lines. So A, we're not going to have an oily mess, and B, we don't have to worry about contaminants getting into the oiling system because it's still completely intact and nothing's open to dirt and debris that can be floating around in the shop. So that's my little tech thing for tonight. So hopefully that's a couple pictures from the steel braid from last week. Hopefully that shed some light on AN hoses for you guys that maybe don't get to use them very often. It's a great way to plumb a vehicle. I love it. I use that for everything. I didn't, thinking back, I should have went ahead and showed all the different style fittings, because you have push lock, you have the crimp fittings, you have the Teflon. So we'll do that we'll show that for another time. But I just want to get something together for you guys. I definitely want to start making sure I have some type of tech experience on each live show. So that was the one for tonight. Hopefully it shed some light, and you guys maybe won't be afraid to use it as much. No problem, Ryan. But yeah, I think the braided stuff works out real well. It is a little pricey to do it, but it makes final product is so nice, and the hoses are rated for typically way more than you need for the part. I mean, like I run the Teflon stuff on power steering lines, and power steering normally runs at 1200 psi on full load, but the Teflon hose is good for almost 3000. So it's just like the AN hose that we were using in this video. That hose is good for like 300-400 psi. You're not going to see that in an oiling system. You might see 110, 120 on a high RPM race engine, maybe. Fuel system, I mean, we have had some race cars where we've ran the fuel pressure up around 100 psi, but again, the hose is rated for 300, so you have a large safety factor in there using the hose, and when assembled properly, it's leak-free. It can be disassembled very easy. Even if you're using the push lock, which I use a lot of times on the Sniper and Terminator installs for fuel, because I can reuse portions of the factory steel lines, and on those systems the fuel never goes over 60 psi, and the push lock is rated for like 125. But the good thing is with the push lock is, even though you've got a hose on barb, you still have a AN fitting to disassemble, so you can quickly do maintenance and not have to cut hose, because if you do rubber on a barb, usually you can't get it back off, so you usually have to razor knife it. Now you have to replace the hose, and most of your rubber hoses are not they don't last very long. So a good quality AN hose will last 10-15 years without dry rotting. Caveat there, if you have it in a fuel system and you leave the fuel system empty, and then that could cause premature rotting, but Typically, the only time I see any kind of braided hose come apart is usually it's a poor quality hose, and that's something to watch from your places where you purchase. It's a old school trick that speed shops used to use, is they buy all the good fittings and then they get China hose, because the hose was way cheaper than the better quality Parker and stuff like that. So buy your hose from somebody reputable. I buy all my stuff from Race Part Solutions. I know that they only stock the Parker hose. It's good quality. You know, I've seen this many times or heard this from customers. They get their car all plumbed up and everything, and a couple months later they're like, man, every time I walk in my garage, all I smell is fuel. And they can't figure out, they don't see any leaks. They're going over the whole thing, can't figure it out. And when I usually talk to them, I'll tell them, stick your nose up against the braided hose and right in the middle of a long length of hose and see what you smell. And sure enough, oh my gosh, I smell fuel. And it's because it's a cheaper quality rubber, and the fuel is actually permeating through the rubber. It's not actually leaking, but the fuel is just doing some kind of chemical deal to the rubber to where the fumes are coming through. If you leave it long enough, it will start leaking fluid, but it leaks the vapor very, very quickly. So always just a good thing when you're buying your hose. Just ask them what kind of hose it is, where it come from, what brand it is, stuff like that. Thanks, Mike. Mike says step-by-step presentation. I appreciate that. I'm trying to I'm teaching myself at the same time. I'm teaching myself to lay these out a little better. And I definitely think doing the slides is working better than when I was doing the little videos and they were just the pictures were just zooming by and I couldn't really discuss what was on in the picture. So I'm happy. Hopefully you guys feel the same way with this. But I definitely think that worked a lot better than the way we were doing them, say 5-6 episodes ago, where it would be a 2-minute video loop. And so I get off that. No problem, John. I appreciate you guys spending your waking hours on Tuesday night coming and watching me babble on YouTube. It's just we're all from all over the country, different places and stuff, and it'd be impossible for us all to more than likely even be friends and then get the bench race. So that's why I like this platform, because anybody can pop on, watch an episode or two, maybe like what we're doing, and then they may catch a live one, and then they can get in on the chat and we can discuss technical things and stuff like that. So I really appreciate you guys watching. I mean, it's it's hard to sit down and do that for 10 minutes, let alone an hour. So anytime you guys are there, I really appreciate it. Mike says, I was planning on using the number 6 black braid for my transmission cooler coming from the 3/8 steel tube. Yes, I do that all the time. I plumb almost all the transmissions with the black braid. It works really nice because you can, I work really hard to make bent tubing, like brake lines and stuff like that. And that's what I forgot to do. I was going to get pictures of the brake system on the Regal, and I didn't do that. We'll do that for next week. So I try to pride myself on making transmission lines out of steel tubing that resemble maybe that GM or Ford could have made them. I get some cars that we do don't warrant steel braid. And customers like, I don't want braid on my car. It's not a race car. I get it. So I'll do the steel lines. The problem with steel lines are, if you have to service the transmission, they're a pain to get off. You have them tied to the block in a couple places. They're rigid, and it just makes them hard to deal with. I find it so much easier to use the braided lines, and then I'll just make a couple tabs come off in different spots and build hangers out of zip ties to hold the braid up. But now it's flexible. If you need to pull the trans out, you can snip a couple of the cable tie mounts, and you can actually let the transmission down to where you can get a regular wrench on the cooler lines and do it properly, rather than using a crow foot and a long extension and holding your tongue in the right position to get the threads started. If you've done them, you know what I'm talking about. It's a nightmare. John says, I just did my transcooler lines with number 6 hydraulic line. Yep. The hydraulic line is obviously very good. That's what it's made for, hydraulic fluid. But it is a little bit stiffer than the braided hose. The braided hose will give you a lot more ability to bend. Most of your transmissions, you got to go around the bell housing. That's at the flywheel and the starter. That's the widest part of the transmission. So it makes it kind of cumbersome with some hose to get around that and make it look neat and stuff. But I mean, any kind of hydraulic hose is way better than the rigid solid line in my eyes. And the thing is, even from the factory, the engine, your line is mounted to the trans and to the engine block, and then it's flexed on motor mounts, and then it goes to the radiator, and the radiator is solid mounted in the car. So there's always got to be, you got to build in a little bit of flex in that area. Just, it's so much easier with braided. Mike says the main reason is move the trans cooler up higher in the vehicle so it doesn't get damaged on and off-road trails. Yep, that's a good reason too. And just a good thing to think about is watch your routing of your fluid and try to hang your cooler so you've put the fluid in the top and out the bottom. If it's a tube style where it's S and it goes back and forth, you definitely want your fluid in the top and exiting the bottom and laying it in that orientation, because any kind of debris that gets in there, if the trans fails, the debris will get stuck in the cooler. A lot of people will mount them because it's easier. They'll mount them with the lines going in the bottom and the S goes up and down, up and down, up and down. Well, every time that goes up and then drops back down, that is a P-trap, like a P-trap in your sink in your kitchen to catch debris. And it's almost impossible to get that out once that debris is in there because it's stuck with oil. The only way you can do it is you have to do a ton of flush, and obviously you'd have to reorientate the cooler so that everything is running downhill so that it gets all out. So with the S style, a tube style cooler, keep that in mind. A plate and bar style cooler, you can run the lines up from the bottom because it goes up and then straight across and then back down again. So the bars across the cooler are straight and smooth. So most of the debris will catch in the manifolds on either end. So it will drain back and it should keep all the debris out. And Mike says he didn't think about that. I'll be truthful about this. I've done it myself. I bet you for the first 20 years I mounted coolers that way because it was really easy, because you could put an Adele clamp around the U part of the tube and mount it up and down vertical, and it mounted nice and easy and looked really cool, and it was rigid mounted. But after a couple blown transmissions and then fighting to get all the debris out of it, I learned that you don't want to do that anymore. So I don't do that anymore. Unless you want to just buy a new cooler every time you smoke the transmission, then you're fine. You can mount it that way. It'll be cool. But yeah, just, it's like a torque converter. If you don't cut the torque converter apart, you really can't get them completely cleaned out. So anytime you're going to try to reuse something, and in drag racing, we reuse the converters and the coolers and all that stuff all the time, because it's some torque converters can cost up into the $10,000-$11,000 range if you get a all aluminum billet bolt together with a lockup clutch in it. So it can get pretty pricey. So you want to be able to use stuff that you can service, so that if and when the transmission fails, you can go through it and correct it, and not have all the debris go into your brand new transmission and ruin it. So things that over the years you just start learning about, you start thinking about all the time. Engine oil coolers is the same way. You really have to watch those when you're running engine oil through it, or if you remote mount your oil filter, because those lines can get loaded up with debris, especially if they go uphill, or if there's droops in the middle of the hose. Those low spots will hold debris, and if you smoke an engine, you're gonna just put all that debris right back into your new engine and mess up your new bearings. So that's one of those things that you always try to work on. I had it with this Regal, and I had it with Leo's Studebaker, where the dry sump tank was mounted below the oil pump. So remember, with a dry sump system, your oil doesn't sit in an oil pan. Your oil sits in a tank outside of the engine. And the scavenge lines go into the pump, your multi-stage pump, and then the scavenge sucks it and then blows it into your reservoir. So that's all the oil going into the reservoir tank. And then from the bottom of the reservoir tank, you're pulling oil to go back in through the pressure side of the pump to feed the engine, go through your filter and what have you. So you got to remember, you got to clean your dry sump tank out if you have a motor failure. So watch when you buy an oil. If you do go to a dry sump system, watch the type tank you buy. So make sure that it's maintenanced. Some of them are really a bear to take apart to maintenance, so you want to think about that. But what I saw in particular with these two cars is the oil level in the dry sump tank is usually about 5/8 of the volume of the tank, because they've got baffles in there where they're taking all the oil that's coming out of the scavenge side, which is going to be aerated, and it's going to be regrouped and go back into a solid liquid form, so that you're pumping out, you're pumping clean, aerated oil back into your motor. So there'll be multiple stages of screens or plates or whatever they use, baffles, to get the oil to get all the air out of it. But on these two particular cars, the oil level in the tank when the engine is running was actually below the oil pump. Now, these oil pumps have a tremendous amount of draw, and it will pull the oil. If you look at some of the NASCAR engines, they put the reservoir tank behind the driver's seat. But it is really high in the car, so that the oil level is above the engine, above the oil pump. But that's what I did on these two vehicles. I moved the tank up so that the oil level was above the level of the dry sump pump. That way, after the car sits, between races, it may sit for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, a year. When you first spin it over, that pump is sucking dry because it's got to build up a vacuum before it can actually pull the oil through. If you have the oil level above the pump, it's already got, through gravity, it's already got oil in the pump. So you're going to keep your pump from galling up, because if it sits and you start turning the pump, especially if you're going to, most people with a dry sump will prime the oil system before they crank the engine. One of the benefits of having a dry sump system. So, but you'll stick a drill on there and spin it, 5,000 RPM to get that prime going. Well, if that pump is dry and it has to actually build, use the momentum to build vacuum to draw the oil out of the tank, that pump could gall before you even get the oil there. So moving the tank up, now the oil is already there through gravity, and now when you turn your pump, start spinning it, it's immediately going to start creating pressure. So again, it will work the other way, but why have it work so when it just takes a couple minutes of design change and maybe remake a couple hoses to move the pump up or the reservoir up to where that's not going to be an issue. So the big takeaway from this is when you're plumbing oil systems and fuel systems, you're doing any kind of fabrication on your race car, truck, overlander, motorcycle, whatever you're working on, always just kind of go over, say, okay, I'm working on the oil system. So here's how the oil system works. Let's go over how the oil system works. And then just look at your components and see if it makes sense. Sometimes you'll see something that, wow, now that I'm actually looking at it, no, that doesn't make sense. All I have to do is move the tank 3 inches and problem solved. So that's what makes us have more trouble-free repair and builds than the guy that doesn't do that. We're looking out for problems before they happen. And it's not that you have to be very high build knowledge or whatever. It just think about the way the system works, and does it make sense? Will it work properly when in that situation? You know, it's like when we were talking about the brake system with the master cylinders. If the master cylinder is under the calipers, you have to put a residual valve to hold the fluid up. You could do the same thing on the oiling system, but you don't really need to have that restrictor in the line for the suction side of the oil pump. But that would work also. If you were in a build position where you couldn't do anything else, that would work. And Earls and a couple other companies do make flapper valves or check valves for all the way up to dash 16. So I mean, they are there, and there may be circumstances that does call for it. But if you can just move a component and fix the problem, that's a freebie. You know, it just took a little time. So my thing to you guys is just keep your eyes open when you're working on stuff. Really look at the way it works. If you don't understand the way it works, try to find something on YouTube or in a manual or ask questions to somebody else that does work with the stuff and find out how, you know, is this going to be an issue? Can that be an issue? And, you know, it's how we all learn. That's how I've learned over all these years. I didn't wake up one day and knew what I know now. I wouldn't say that I'm smart. I'm trained. I've learned after doing this stuff for 40 years. I've run across all these problems. So, my philosophy has always been every day try to learn something new. So when a catastrophe happens, I try to learn from it and don't ever let that catastrophe happen again. It doesn't mean you won't have another, you know, engine catastrophe or transmission catastrophe, but if you can minimize by doing your assembly correctly, or, you know, to make it all make sense, it just works out that much better down the road, and you'll end up having less trouble, and, you know, you'll be happy, you know, to just put a car together and take it for a ride and drive it, and it all worked out. That's you know, that's a goal that we all have. We all want to drive our cars, use them, our vehicles, you know, use them for transportation, use them for fun, use them for entertainment, use them for racing, whatever it is. And the last thing we want to do is be working on them needlessly. So again, just kind of, I always like to stand back, look at it, and go, okay, how does this system work? Is it laid out correctly, or do we need to make something to make it better? Like I said, those tri-sump tanks, low mounted, worked, but it's not. It can be made better. So, and as easy as loosening up the clamps and sliding the tanks up, and cutting a couple pieces of hose. And again, that's why I lubricate my fittings, so I didn't have to buy any fittings. I just had to put a new piece of hose in, way cheaper, and made it work. So that's the way we do that. That's the way I do this stuff. I hope you know, you guys can take something away from this and make your next build that much easier. So guess I babbled on about braided hose and stuff, I guess, tonight long enough. I'm not 100% sure what I'm gonna do for next week. Got to see what I can get done. I'm gonna try to have this Regal running by Saturday. They want to do a little promo shoot for the like a commercial, I guess, whatever, for the race. So we're gonna try to get that thing done. So maybe I'll do something with pre-engine running or something like that. Your step-by-step checklist you need to do. Oh, Chris is on. Hey, hi George. What is the best way to cut the AN fuel line? And I need find power source for the 2 fuel pumps. So if you I don't know what time you clocked in on the show tonight. If you rewatch it, you'll see I prefer a pair of cable cutters. That is what I like to use it. If you keep them nice and sharp, they'll cut straight through in one squeeze of the handles, and it won't fray the end of the hose, and it makes it go right into the fittings, easy peasy. You can use a abrasive cutoff wheel. You probably should use electrical tape and tape the spot where you're going to cut it right through the middle of the braid. But remember, if you use tape, you have to remove the tape before you put it in the hose in the fitting. The tape is not supposed to be in there and will work against you for keeping the hose in the sleeve properly. So that's the way. I know, Chris, you're local, so if you want, you can bring a hose over here and I'll show you my cutter. You can watch the video. So as far as a power source for your fuel pumps, so you should have the ECU is going to activate your relays. Let's step back. First, you should have relays to turn the pumps on, because your ECU or toggle switch would be a low. The cutoff wheel leaves dirt. The cable cutter does not. I clean my lines afterwards, but you don't have to worry about it. It's clean. But on the fuel pumps, most fuel pumps will take 10, 15 amps, so it's a lot of load on a toggle switch, or definitely on a driver and an ECU. So you definitely want to run a relay. And then so let's go with a standard Bosch Hella style relay. They have a numbering system on it, and it'll have a 30, an 87, an 85, and an 86. And it may have an 87A. 87A is for normally closed. So anyway, 30 is your power source. So on the relay, your 30 should be going, I would put it right directly to the battery, because the relay is going to turn them on and off. So you can put a fuse large enough to handle the pumps. So if your pump is a 10 amp draw, I would put a 15 amp fuse on that leg that goes to 30 on the relay. And then 87 would be the power wire or ground wire, depending on which way you're switching, to your fuel pump. Well, let me preface that. If you're putting 30 battery voltage, then you're switching power to the fuel pump, and 87 would be a power wire. If you bring a ground to circuit 30 and the relay, then 87 would be connected to the ground of the fuel pump. So I want to make sure that was clear. So typically I switch on the power side. So battery power on your leg, on your terminal 30, 87 to your fuel pump. Now your 85 and your 86 are for the coil to activate the relay. So one side gets a ground, one side gets 12 volts. And that's depending on what you're using to trigger what you need. So a lot of ECUs will trigger the ground side. So you would put key voltage going to 86, and 85 would go to your ECU, and your ECU would output a ground, which would activate the relay and turn the fuel pump on. and vice versa. If you are using something that is going to switch on the power side, then ground would go to chassis ground, and the power side would come from your switch or ECU or whatever you're using to activate the pump. So I know in your car you're using an OEM ECU, so you're definitely pump one is going to be turned on through the factory fuel pump circuit that's already in the ECU. Second fuel pump, that just depends on how you guys are going to wire that up, whether you're going to use a pressure switch, or if there's another circuit in the ECU that you could make trigger the second fuel pump. You could use an RPM output through MSD makes RPM boxes where you can adjust it so at a certain RPM it will activate a circuit, so like turn a shift light on or something. Well, that would also, you could also use that to activate a relay, because relays are only like 1 amp draw, same as a incandescent light bulb. So you could make that work very simple. So there's a lot of ways you can do it. Aftermarket ECUs, they'll have they'll usually have a second pump pre-labeled where you can use RPM, throttle position, or map pressure. Or like with a Holly, you can take an output circuit and write a table and make it come on any way you want with any of the sensors. So that's how you want to do that. Like I said, I would bring them. You could bring them off the. You could bring that 30 circuit off an ignition output, but the problem that I get worried with that, first of all, the fuel pump's in the back of the car. More than likely, your battery's in the back of the car, so that makes the wire short. The second thing is, you get to a certain point and you're really running a lot of amperage through the factory ignition switch. And Chris, you've already ran into that where the wiring in the car was too small for all the components in the car to be run through the ignition switch, and you start having electrical problems. That's why on new cars, they don't run everything through the key switch. Now, they got body control modules and stuff like that that handle all the heavy work, and the key switch just sends a signal to the body control or to the ECU. So that takes all the amperage draw out of your ignition switch. So you got to think about those kind of things when you're laying out your wiring, just as if you were laying out your plumbing for your oil or transmission or fuel. You want to look at what you got going on, and it's real easy. If you have fuel pumps, two cooling fans, electric water pump for the intercooler pump, ECU power, all your other accessories, AC, anything that's turned on by the key, you got to remember all that stuff is all going through that key switch. So if you start adding up all those amperages, you'll find out that you're way over 100 amps on a circuit that wasn't designed for that. Chris says, Justin said run both fuel pumps at the same time. Okay, that's fine too, because you're not streeting the car that much, and if you got big fuel lines on there, so that's not going to be an issue. Sometimes you can have issues where the fuel you're flowing so much volume of fuel, especially in stop and go traffic, that the fuel starts getting hot. It was a big problem we had back in the 80s with the 5.0 Mustangs, because everybody started putting turbos and superchargers on these cars and making 800-900 horsepower, and so there wasn't a lot of selection of fuel pumps back then. So we'd end up with the big, Aeromotive now, but they used to be. There was a couple other companies that had these big pumps. Paxton had a big blue pump, and that pump actually flowed so much fuel that the fuel would be rotating, through the pump filter, up to the fuel rails, back to the trunk, back in the fuel tank, and back at, making these loops that the fuel eventually would start getting so hot it would start aerating the fuel and cavitating the pump. And our fix back then, because we didn't know any better, we'd put a transmission cooler on the return line, and that would help cool the fuel to stop that. Then companies like Aeromotive made variable speed controllers so that when the throttle was below 30%, it would lower the voltage to the fuel pump, so the fuel pump is only running at 6 volts or 7 volts, so it's not pumping the amount of fuel to create that heat. But on your car, you're not going to have an issue, and you're not running that big of fuel pumps. So running both fuel pumps off the stock relay, off the stock ECU, here's how I would do this. I would run the stock trigger wire to fuel pump number 1, and the 87, which is the switched wire coming out of that relay, I would run to pump number 1, but I'd also run a second wire going to the second relay. So the computer still only sees one relay voltage drop, but yet the relay for pump number 1 is activating pump number 2. So that way the ECU doesn't see the load, but yet you still turn both pumps on full time, and they'll handle the power, and everything will be fine. Now, getting back to the ignition switches, another way you can correct this issue with these late model cars, or these early cars with the ignition switches and the amount of amperage draw through these cars. Once again, a 60s car only had a 50 amp alternator on it. That's all it needed. That covered everything in the car. So your ignition switch was probably only rated for about 75 amps. Now you look at a new car, the alternators are way over 125 amp, all the way up to 200 amp, because everything in the car now, electric steering and all this other stuff, everything's becoming electric now, which is great for taking load off the engine. But now you got to think about the load on your electrical system. So that same 75 amp key switch is not going to work for all the components that you have in the car that need to be activated key on. So what you can do there is you can put a high amperage continuous duty solenoid or relay in the car next to your battery. So you put, we do them in race cars all the time. We put that 500 amp continuous duty solenoid, which only takes 1 amp to keep it activated, and you can run that as a junction block to run power to all your components. That way your key switch only has to have the key, the starter wire, an ignition, and a couple of trigger wires going to like your ECU ignition and stuff like that, to your dash cluster and stuff. So keeping your amperage in check at the key switch and letting that continuous duty relay in the back of the car next to your battery, front or back, whichever it is, let that one do all the work of all the other components in the car. Makes it for a lot easier scenario. Now, we started doing it in race cars because in racing you have to have a battery kill switch. The rescue crews want to be able to hit a switch and kill all power in the car. So it doesn't matter where you race, if it's a stock car, SCCA road race, drag racing, all the different sanctioning bodies mandate the same thing. So we put the battery in the back, and of course when we were running total loss, so there was no alternator in the car, no problem. 2-lug battery switch in the back of the car with a switch to turn it on and off, no problem. Well, then people got tired of charging their batteries in between rounds. They say, hey, let's put an alternator on the car. Well, now you put an alternator on, and with that same 2-lug battery switch, when you shut the power off, the car does not shut off because the alternator is creating power on the off lug of the battery switch, and it makes its own loop and keeps the car running. So now that emergency switch is not doing anything. So you have to run a 4-post switch when you're running an alternator. Well, then as time goes on, now we're running lithium-ion batteries and AAGM batteries, which don't off-gas. So now we're putting the batteries in the front of the car where we want the weight, instead of having them stuck in the rear of the car where we may not necessarily want the weight. So now you have a battery kill switch that needs to be in the back of the car, but your battery's in the front of the car. So how do you correct that situation? Well, that's how we start using these high amp solenoids. So we put a high amp solenoid next to the battery, and we just have to run 2 little 12-volt wires, 20 gauge wires to a E stop switch on the back of the car. You punch the stop switch, that breaks the link to the relay, relay opens, car shuts off. Easy as that. And it's a lot lighter and all that. So, but those same circuits would work good on a vintage car where you're going to be running a lot of accessories through everything in the car. So, again, one of those things to think about. Just kind of rationalize what is going to happen before you start doing it, and it'll help you out in the long run. Same way that electricians wire a house. They look at how many outlets and what circuits are going to be plugged into those, and that tells them how many amp breaker they have to put in, and that tells them how many total amps the entire system has to have. So that's the correct way of doing things. We in the automotive field don't always do things the correct way, but as we keep evolving these vintage vehicles and making them more modern, even though it's old steel, we're going to have to start looking into ways of doing things better so that we don't have to worry about electrical fires and oil fires and fuel fires and stuff like that. So I will show one of those continuous duty relays next week on the Regal. I'll get some pictures of that because I'm at that point on that car. So I'll show you what we're doing there. Really nice on that because you can do dual switches. It was a big thing back in the day. You jump in your race car, you get all your belts on and everything, helmet and gear, and then you realize, oh, the battery switch is off. Shit. I got to go all the way to, unhook everything, go to the back of the car, turn it on, or I got to yell and scream till I catch somebody's attention and explain to them what they need to do. Then a couple clever guys were hooking up cables with a handle in the car so that they could push the handle inside the car and the cable would push the switch in the back of the car. But, it's more components and stuff like that. With these continuous duty relay solenoid assemblies that we're using, now that loop wire that activates that, we can put two switches. We can have a switch in the cockpit and we have a switch in the back. So all you have to do is use one or the other to kill the car. And you're getting ready to get in the car, you can pull the switch in the back. That does not activate the battery yet, but now with your switch off in the inside the car, you can still leave it off till you're ready to go. But now once you're belted in, you can pull that switch on, powers up the car. You don't have to worry about battery draw. And then now you have two forms of shutting off the car in case of emergency. Driver can shut it off internally, or emergency crew can shut it off externally. So things to think about. I think I rambled on long enough tonight. My wife hasn't been working on Tuesdays. They changed her schedule around, so she's in the house cooking dinner, waiting for me to come in. So I think this is a good spot. We'll call it a night. I appreciate everybody getting on and commenting and watching. Everybody that doesn't comment, thank you for watching. If you miss sections of it, it'll be on the channel. You can rewatch the sections. I think it's a fairly good technical section tonight on AN fittings and assembly. So take a look at it. We did brakes last week, so remember every week we're going to do that, and I'm going to try to do that tech section right around 10 after, quarter after, so it'll be pretty much in the beginning of the replays. Mike says, Doug got me using the continuous duty solenoids. I have one in the Suburban, cause all the added accessories. I don't want to draw on the battery. Correct. Exactly right. And I used to use them for cooling fans. Cooling fans was always notorious for burning up 30 amp Bosch relays, because when they would activate or on high load, when the engine's really hot, they would cross that threshold of 30 amps and burn the relay up. So you put an 80 amp continuous duty, looks like a Ford starter solenoid, and that fan will sing forever, and the relay is nowhere near maxed out. So anyway, thanks, Mark. Mario, I'm sorry. Have a great night. Mike, Chris, John, Ryan. Ryan, side note, that truck is coming along, man. I like the shop inspector's attitude with the rear bumper. That was funny. But anyway, I'm going to call it a night here. Thanks everybody for getting on, and I'll see everybody next Tuesday. Have a great week. See ya.